Something is shifting inside an NFL building right now, and almost nobody outside of Cleveland is treating it with the weight it actually deserves. This isn't a hot take manufactured for clicks. This isn't a slow news cycle getting stretched into something it isn't. The Browns facility in Berea, Ohio, is experiencing a genuine, documentable power shift in real time, and the people closest to it are making statements in public that should be generating far bigger headlines than they are. What makes this particularly fascinating is the timing. We're not talking about whispers from anonymous sources or speculation dressed up as reporting. We're talking about a head coach whose entire professional future depends on making the right call, an ESPN reporter with more actual access inside that locker room than almost anyone in the industry, and daily practice reports leaking out of closed sessions, all pointing in the same direction. A direction that contradicts the version of this story that most of the football world has already decided is true. So before camp opens, before the pads go on, before the first preseason snap gets taken, let's actually go through what's been documented, what's been said on record, and why this quarterback competition is one of the most consequential storylines in the entire NFL right now. Not just for this season, for the next several years of a franchise that has been waiting for stability at the most important position in professional sports for longer than most of its fan base wants to remember. Here's where we need to start, because the foundation of this entire conversation has been quietly rotting for months and almost nobody has bothered to check it. Deshaun Watson is a 9-year NFL veteran. He earned a massive long-term contract. He has championship-caliber pedigree from his time in Houston, and before his body started breaking down, he was genuinely showing flashes of elite quarterback play. That's the version of this story that most people locked in and never updated. The problem is that version stopped being accurate a long time ago. What Watson actually is right now is a player who has spent more time in a training facility over the last several years than he has on an actual football field. Recurring shoulder problems, then an ACL, then an Achilles rupture that ended his season before it ever had a real chance to breathe. We're not talking about one rough year. We're talking about a multi-year stretch of injuries so severe that most athletes don't come back from even one of them, let alone the combination Watson has had to fight through. And on the other side of this competition is a fifth-round pick who by every measure the draft community uses to evaluate quarterbacks had no business sliding that far. Anyone who watched him play in college knew it. The draft capital assigned to him had almost nothing to do with what the tape actually showed, and almost everything to do with factors that had nothing to do with football. He came into his rookie year carrying that draft slide, stepped into a starting role on a team that finished 5-12, and played 7 games behind an offensive line that was actively falling apart in real time. That's your setup, a battered veteran trying to reclaim something he hasn't fully had in years, and a second-year player who got thrown into one of the harshest possible situations a young quarterback can face and came out the other side still standing. What's happening between them right now in that building in Berea is not what you think it is, and the numbers are the first place that becomes obvious. Let's talk about something that has been almost completely ignored in the mainstream coverage of this competition because it directly dismantles one of the most confidently stated arguments being made in Watson's favor. Joe Thomas, Browns legend, one of the most respected voices connected to that franchise, came out and said that Watson gives you something Sanders simply can't match with his legs: the ability to scramble, to extend plays, to make something happen when the pocket breaks down. It's the kind of statement that gets nodded along with because it comes from a credible source and it fits the established narrative perfectly. The only problem is, if you actually go look at the numbers, it doesn't hold up. Take the last 7 starts from both of these quarterbacks. That's a fair, roughly even sample. In those 7 starts, Shedeur Sanders rushed for 169 yards. Deshaun Watson rushed for 148 yards in his last 7. That's already a gap that shouldn't exist if Thomas's framing is accurate. But it gets more specific than that. Sanders averaged 8.0 yards per carry in that stretch. Watson averaged 4.8. And then you get to the scramble numbers, which are the most direct measure of exactly what Thomas was describing. Watson averaged 6.3 yards per scramble in those 7 starts. Sanders averaged 9.3, 3 full yards more per scramble, on average, per attempt. Now, the honest version of this is that the sample is limited, and these numbers aren't so dramatically better that they prove Sanders is some generational athlete. That's not the argument. The argument is much simpler than that. The most commonly repeated reason why Watson has the advantage with his legs is not supported by the most recent available data. If anything, the recent data points in the other direction. And there's one more layer to this that tends to get overlooked entirely. Watson never led the Browns in rushing in any of his 7 starts. Shedeur Sanders led his team in rushing in 3 of his 7 starts as a rookie. He was within 10 yards of leading the team in rushing in 5 of those 7 games. A rookie quarterback behind a porous offensive line on a losing team, carrying the ground game more than his veteran counterpart ever did in a comparable window. That doesn't make Sanders the answer, but it absolutely makes the Watson gives you more with his legs arguments a lot harder to say with a straight face. A few weeks ago, Jeremy Fowler said something on television that should have been treated as a significant development in this story. Fowler covers the Browns for ESPN. He has more real, documented access inside that building than almost any reporter working this beat. He's not a personality generating takes. He's a reporter with sources, and when he characterizes what those sources are telling him, it carries a different weight than opinion. What Fowler said was this: the quarterback competition in Cleveland is genuinely intense. Not a formality, not a situation where the veteran holds the job while the young guy gets evaluated for next year. A real competition. The kind that would likely extend through every padded practice in camp and into actual preseason games before anyone had a clean answer. And then he said the part that should have stopped people in their tracks. Watson was the obvious frontrunner going into the spring. Sanders has since caught up. Sit with that phrasing for a second, because it's doing a lot of work. A gap doesn't close on its own. One player doesn't catch up to another because the frontrunner simply stayed still. For Sanders to have caught up to Watson over the course of spring practices, one of 2 things had to happen. Either Watson declined from where people expected him to be, or Sanders made a genuine, measurable leap that nobody on the outside was fully prepared for. Fowler even acknowledged that Watson looks explosive again and appears fully recovered from the Achilles, so the former explanation gets softer, which means the latter carries more weight. This isn't one anonymous source whispering something to a reporter looking for a story. This is a credentialed journalist with his name attached, speaking on national television, describing what people with real eyes in that locker room are telling him repeatedly, consistently, over the course of an entire offseason. That's not a rumor. That's a persistent trend being reported by someone accountable for what he says. And Fowler wasn't the only one saying it. The most important statement made about this quarterback competition didn't come from a reporter or an analyst or former player with an opinion. It came from Todd Monken, the head coach, the man whose own job security is directly tied to whether this decision gets made correctly. Monken talked about what he's seen from Sanders during the spring. He said Sanders is becoming more decisive, the ball is coming out faster. And then he said the part that reveals exactly how he's actually grading these 2 quarterbacks. Cutting out the negative plays, eliminating the unnecessary sacks, getting rid of the moments where the ball sits a half beat too long. That, Monken said, is going to be the actual separator. Not arm strength, not athleticism, not highlight reel throws. Decision speed and the ability to stop hurting your own team.
Now consider what that framing means for both players in this competition, because it's not neutral, it's pointing somewhere specific. Todd Monken has a coaching philosophy. It's not hidden. You can trace it through every stop of his career. He does not take jobs to showcase arm talent. He takes jobs to fix decision-making, correct tempo, and clean up situational execution. That's his entire professional identity as an offensive mind. The things he's describing as the separator in this competition are the exact things he was hired to address. And here's what that means for Shedeur Sanders specifically. His rookie year included somewhere between 9 and 10 interceptions. That number exists. It's real. Nobody who genuinely wants this kid to succeed should try to make it disappear or dress it up into something it wasn't. But what Monken is describing, more decisiveness, faster release, fewer self-inflicted negative plays, is tangible, visible, in-progress evidence that the exact correction this staff was hired to make is actually happening, right now, on this month's practice tape. That's not a projection. That's not a scout's optimistic read of long-term potential. That's a head coach watching daily film and describing out loud what he sees improving in front of him. When the man responsible for this offense tells you the separator is decision speed and the ball coming out faster, and then separately tells you that one of the quarterbacks is becoming more decisive and the ball is coming out faster, he is not being subtle about which direction this is moving. Let's actually give the rookie year the honest treatment it deserves, because it's been evaluated in almost exclusively the wrong way by almost everyone outside of that building. 7 touchdowns, 9 or 10 interceptions, 5 and 12 team. Those are the numbers people point to when they want to pump the brakes on Sanders' enthusiasm. And on the surface, that's a reasonable reaction. Interceptions matter. Turnovers lose games. A quarterback who can't protect the football cannot be trusted with an NFL offense. All of that is true. What is also true is the context in which every single one of those numbers was produced. Sanders was a 5th-round rookie. He wasn't supposed to be playing at all in year 1 under normal circumstances. He got thrown into starting duty not because he was ready in some ideal, perfectly developed sense, but because the guy in front of him got hurt. He was then asked to run an NFL offense behind an offensive line that was giving up pressure on what felt like every other snap, with a receiving group that was still figuring out timing and chemistry with each other, let alone with a new quarterback who had never taken a regular season NFL snap. Think about what that environment actually does to a quarterback's decision-making. When your protection is collapsing with that kind of frequency, you're not going through your full progression. You're not waiting for the second or third option to come open. You're making survival decisions under duress, and those decisions are happening faster than any amount of pre-snap preparation can fully account for. 10-year veterans start making hasty, desperate choices to survive the play when they're getting that kind of consistent pressure. Put a rookie in the same situation, and some of what happens starts to sound less like a character flaw and more like a predictable outcome of an impossible circumstance. Context is not an excuse. The distinction between evaluating something fairly and evaluating it carelessly is context. A person analyzing film from a press box 2 days after the game is not operating under the same conditions as a 5th-round rookie fighting to survive a live NFL snap with no time and no clean pocket. The interceptions reveal part of the story. They do not reveal all of it. What the people inside that building are describing now, the increased decisiveness, the faster release, the cleaner process reads, is a player who got burned by specific mistakes in live NFL games and came back in the offseason actively, measurably correcting them. That's the most valuable possible evidence you can have about a young quarterback, not that he was perfect, that when he wasn't, he fixed it. In fairness to Watson, let's be precise about where he actually stands right now, because the answer is more complicated than either side of this debate tends to acknowledge. By all available accounts, Watson's physical recovery has gone better than expected. His legs appear to have regained their explosiveness. He's moving like an athlete again, rather than like a man carefully managing a surgically repaired body through every rep. For a player who has been through what he's been through, the shoulder, the ACL, the Achilles, that kind of recovery is genuinely remarkable and shouldn't be minimized.
But here's the thing about physical recovery that tends to get glossed over in these conversations. Being medically cleared and being mentally and rhythmically ready to run an NFL offense are not the same milestone. They don't arrive at the same time. They don't follow the same timeline. A quarterback's ability to process a defense, to trust his legs on a designed run without a subconscious hesitation, to fire into a tight window with complete conviction rather than just the absence of visible doubt, all of that gets rebuilt more slowly than muscle tissue and repaired ligaments. Watson is simultaneously healing physically, rebuilding that mental and rhythmic trust, and learning a completely new offensive system under a new head coach for the first time. That's not one challenge, that's 3 distinct challenges stacked directly on top of each other, each one demanding something from him at the same time. Sanders is dealing with exactly one of those 3 challenges. He's also learning the new system, everyone in that building is, but he is not simultaneously reconstructing his body and rebuilding his confidence after a multi-year injury nightmare. He gets to bring his full cognitive and physical bandwidth to one problem, instead of dividing it across several. When you frame it that way, the fact that he's closed the gap on a 9-year veteran doesn't sound like a stunning underdog story. It starts to sound like the entirely logical outcome of a competition where one player is carrying significantly less weight than the other one. There is a chess match happening beneath the surface of this quarterback competition that almost nobody in the mainstream conversation is paying attention to, and it changes the stakes of everything being evaluated inside that building this summer. Cleveland currently holds 2 first-round picks in the 2027 NFL Draft. That's not a coincidence, it's the direct result of the trade compensation attached to the Myles Garrett situation, and the 2027 draft class has already been flagged by evaluators across the league as one of the deepest quarterback classes in recent memory. That context transforms what this competition actually means. If you think this is just about who starts week 1 of the upcoming regular season, you're missing the real game. The outcome of what happens in Berea this summer directly determines how Cleveland's front office approaches one of the richest quarterback drafts anyone has seen in years. Those are premium selections. How you deploy them depends entirely on what you believe you already have at the position. If Sanders wins this competition and plays even close to what his college tape and late-season rookie flashes suggests he's capable of, Cleveland can use both of those first-round picks to build the roster around him. Offensive line, weapons, defense. You're refining a response, not searching for the question. The franchise is in an entirely different position entering that draft. If Watson wins the job and plays well, you've got a different kind of stability, but now you're also spending the entire season trying to evaluate whether Sanders is a long-term starter, a valuable trade asset, or potentially a future internal challenger. That's a more complicated front office situation to navigate, but it still leaves options on the table. Either direction shapes this organization for years, not months, and that larger picture helps explain something about how Sanders himself has conducted the entire offseason. His public comments about this competition have been notably calm, composed in a way that's actually unusual for a player in his exact position. A second-year player who was drafted lower than he deserved, who got thrown into a brutal situation as a rookie, who is now being asked to compete for a starting job against a veteran with a massive contract and nearly a decade of NFL experience. That's a player with 100 legitimate reasons to show frustration, to let the noise in, to perform confidence rather than actually having it. Instead, by every account coming out of Berea, he is locked into the work, locked into addressing the specific problems this staff identified, not focused on the contract chatter, not responding to the draft slide narrative, not performing for the outside audience, just fixing the things that need to be fixed. That matters more than most people appreciate, because when a coaching staff is deciding between 2 quarterbacks, they're evaluating not just arm talent and processing speed, they're evaluating whether they trust a player to handle adversity without it becoming a distraction. A rookie who throws double-digit interceptions and comes back defensive about it is showing you one thing. A rookie who throws double-digit interceptions comes back in the offseason and visibly tightens up the exact decisions that caused those turnovers. That player is showing you something completely different. One of those quarterbacks is demonstrating he's coachable under pressure. The other might already be showing you his ceiling. Everything coming out of Cleveland this spring points towards Sanders being firmly in that first category. And that, more than any individual statistic or practice report, is probably why this competition has lasted as long as it has.
Here's where this actually goes from here, and why the next several weeks matter more than anything that's happened so far. Spring practices are non-contact. They're valuable. You can learn a lot about a quarterback's processing, his command of the system, his footwork and release, and how he handles simulated pressure. But they have a fundamental limit. Nobody is actually hitting anyone. Hesitation doesn't cost you the same way it costs you when 300 pounds of defensive end is actively trying to separate you from the football. Training camp changes that. The pads go on. Throwing windows shrink. Pressure is real. Pocket timing becomes an immediate, penalized variable rather than a theoretical one. And that's typically the moment when everything that spring practice suggested gets either confirmed or completely overturned. For Sanders, camp is the moment where the improved decisiveness Monken described either holds up under live contact or gets exposed as something that only works without physical consequences attached to it. For Watson, camp is the moment where we find out whether a surgically repaired body that looks recovered in controlled settings still looks recovered when it's absorbing actual NFL hits and carrying a full contact workload. Neither of those questions has been answered yet. Monken hasn't named a starter because, genuinely, he doesn't know who his guy is. And anyone outside that building who claims to know for certain is selling confidence they don't actually possess. But here's what has been established with real, documented evidence over the course of this entire offseason. The people who watch every snap, who track pre-snap reads and protection calls and route adjustments in real time, who are in that building every single day, those people have been describing a gap that was supposed to be insurmountable as something that has been actively and consistently closing. Not completely closed, not formally resolved, but narrowing in a direction that the comfortable outside narrative never accounted for. The ground beneath Watson's so-called obvious frontrunner status has been quietly shifting for months. The outside world largely hasn't noticed because accepting that shift requires updating a mental model that was already locked in. It requires taking seriously a player most people wrote off at the draft and never fully reconsidered. It requires sitting with the discomfort of a story that doesn't end the way the established script says it should. The people actually inside that building have been quietly and persistently telling a different version of events all offseason. Not loudly, not with dramatic proclamations, just steadily, consistently, with their names attached and their credibility on the line. That disconnect between the story the outside world is comfortable telling and the story the people closest to the situation are actually reporting is the entire point. It always was. Once the lights brighten, the pads finally go on and the preseason games start to matter, we'll find out which version was true the whole time. But one thing is already clear. Anyone still treating this as a foregone conclusion hasn't been paying attention to what's actually been happening in Berea. And when the answer finally comes, a lot of people are going to have to admit they were looking at the wrong version of this story the whole time.